Hello, and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this weekend I'm talking to the historian Douglas Smith, who's recently written The Russian Job, the forgotten story of how America saved the Soviet Union from ruin. We're going all the way back to 1921 to 1923 in the Soviet Union, a newly emerged nation teetering on the brink of collapse due to a famine, and talking about relief efforts brought in by the United States, Herbert Hoover, a Quaker president there for you, who leads the American Relief Administration and a group of young men who go over to the Soviet Union to provide food from America and famine relief. It's an incredible story and one you should check out. The book is just out, and Douglas Smith has written it in a readable and intriguing manner. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, the Hour of History blog, and more, head over to hourofhistory.com. For book recommendations about topics mentioned during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, the Hour of History starts right now.
So welcome to the Hour of History podcast, Douglas Smith. It's good to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, your new book, The Russian Job, the forgotten story of how America saved the Soviet Union from ruin. First of all, wow, what a title. It's an interesting new work that sort of builds upon your success in Russian history. Could you tell listeners a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I studied German and Russian languages in college at the University of Vermont. It's sort of a double major in both languages. And I kind of just fell into doing Russian, recommended by a professor. This was in the early 80s when it was still the bad days of the Cold War. And then I started going to Russia to study and then later to work for the State Department. And I became fascinated with the history of the country through my visits and study of the language and what have you. And then I went and got a PhD in Russian history at UCLA. And basically, I've just been writing books on Russia ever since. The Russian Job here is my sixth book. I've written 3 on the 18th century and now 3 books on the 20th century.
And it's very interesting because on the Hour of History, I have a lot of people who are still firmly intermeshed with academia, and you've created quite a career outside. Maybe a word or two about that for people who are interested in options.
Yeah, I mean, when I was getting my PhD in Russian history in the late 90s, it was kind of analogous to becoming a specialist in the Ottoman Empire around 1921 or something. I mean, there was the sense that with the Cold War over, with the Soviet Union gone, we didn't really need all these Russian specialists. So there basically were no jobs. And I found that doing adjunct teaching as professor was not terribly rewarding. And I started doing sort of academic kind of scholarly writing. And I just found that I wanted to be able to convey to non-specialists my passion for Russia and for its history and its culture. And so I kind of shifted and said, I want to try to write books that, my wife would enjoy, my family members would enjoy, non-specialists would enjoy. And so that's kind of what I've been trying to do ever since.
And that's fantastic. And I think you can really sort of see that impact. I mean, I see people on the subway with your books, certainly with that jarring Rasputin cover you had in the past.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool. And that, it's good for other historians to hear that. Now, if we could dive into your new book, maybe you can set the scene for us. This post-World War, post-Russian Revolution, it's kind of a crazy time.
Yeah, so the book covers roughly 2 years, 1921 to 1923. And Russia at the time was completely devastated and on its knees. I mean, going back to the summer of 1914 when it enters World War I, and then through 2 revolutions in 1917, first the collapse of the Romanovs, then the Bolshevik seizure of power and fall, which then ushers in several years of one of the most brutal, horrific civil wars in world history. And then you get 2 years of drought on top of that. Basically, the country is starving and is destroyed. The cities are destroyed. Um, and uh, it's something that I think most Americans have no understanding of, is just how devastatingly violent and disruptive the revolutions and then civil war were for Russia, and how it left the country literally, gasping for life.
Yeah, and I mean, we're coming up on 100 years. It's always hard to gauge, what people remember from 10 or 20 years ago, much less 100 years on the other side of the world. But it's a fascinating time period. How did that transition go between this Russian Empire and the Soviet Union?
It did not go well. It did not go well. What Russia has been through in the 20th century is mind-boggling. Multiple wars, starting with the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. You have the Revolution of 1905 that was violent but did not bring down the regime, and then World War One, Civil War. You've got World War II. You've got Stalin's terror. It's just remarkable that anybody in Russia survived the 20th century, let alone that they were able to rebuild their economy, and in terms of the sciences and the arts, to produce some truly amazing achievements. It's pretty remarkable. And so I'm hoping that with my book, I will not only inform Americans about this really powerful moment in our history when we did a truly remarkable humanitarian deed, but also for them to gain a greater appreciation of just how difficult life was for Russia in the early years of the 1920s.
Yeah, and so that's a great place to sort of get into it. You mentioned the word humanitarian, and you're sort of talking about we as the United States now. Um, Now people might associate the United States with doing things abroad for other nations. Was that the case back then? Who is this that's going to help in the Soviet Union in the famine?
Yeah, well, this was new, really relatively new for the United States, or really for any country, to be involved in large humanitarian projects on the other side of the globe. I mean, that kind of charity and humanitarian work is relatively new. It was led by Herbert Hoover, who we all remember as the president, starting in 1928 to 32, when he was president during the Depression. But he made his name originally, and fame and wealth, as an amazing operator in the world of international mining. Became very wealthy, very famous, very connected. And then he got involved in charity relief during World War One. He became known as the savior of Belgium, putting together a massive relief effort when the Belgians had been invaded by Germany in World War One and cut off from food and faced starvation. And then later, after World War One, he pushed then President Wilson to create something called the American Relief Administration, which had, I think, backing of about $100 million from Congress to help rebuild and feed war-torn Western Europe after World War One. So this was the man who sort of put it all together and then led the charge to go off and feed Russia once its famine hit in 1921.
And Herbert Hoover, you mentioned he has successful mining businesses. He's kind of a global figure. What is his connection there to the Soviet Union?
Well, before the war and before the collapse of the Romanov dynasty in 1917, he had owned and operated various mines in the Tsarist Empire, in the old Russian Empire. So he had been to Russia, he had seen it, he was terrified of what he saw. He literally was like, this country is going to blow up one day, he said, and he was prescient. He was right. Of course, others had realized that as well. But he worked all around the world, was an amazing administrator, very bright, very hardworking, and it had made him a ton of money. He was living in London with his family in 1914 when World War I started, and had sort of amassed a great fortune. But you get a sense from his biography that he'd also sort of lost a bit of his excitement for business, that sort of achieved, the top of the business world that he was in, and he was almost sort of looking for new challenges, I think. I also think, looking at his biography, he was a Quaker, and he had been raised by a family that stressed the importance of the need to be of service to humanity, that it wasn't enough just to focus on one's own personal needs and desires and wants, but one had to think broader about society in general. And I think this was also important in what led him into humanitarian work.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting point. And when you kind of juxtapose this with the beginning of sort of the Roaring Twenties, I mean, this is a vastly different scene in Europe with the devastation that was there. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about this American Relief Administration. Who's actually going over to Europe and working to prevent famine?
So the ARA set up, as Hoover's idea with the help of Congress and President Wilson, had been created to fight famine and hunger and want throughout Europe and beyond, kind of in the parts of the Eastern Mediterranean as well, after the end of World War I. And again, the United States obviously didn't suffer the way Europe did as a result of the fighting. And so, their economies were destroyed. Agriculture was in great despair. And Hoover saw the need to go over and hired a lot of young American men, typically all men, not so much women, to go over. Some of them were World War I veterans themselves, or they were fresh out of college. A good number of them had been Rhodes Scholars in England. And they went around and set up sort of basic, food kitchens and medical relief operations all over Western Europe.
And it just seems to sort of contradict what one might think. The Soviet Union, when I have heard of it in the past and read of it in the past, this is a sort of, as you mentioned, brutal revolution, and then immediately they have to establish a new rule of order if they're going to in any way solidify power. It doesn't do to have foreigners coming in, especially these young American foreigners who might shift some ideological thoughts as they're giving out aid. How did the interaction between those Americans and I guess these new Soviets go?
Well, yeah. So that whole period is very complicated, because Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power from the provisional government in the fall of 1917, and there had been a vote throughout Russia to create a constituent assembly when all the various political parties in Russia were going to come together to try to create a new constitutional order. Well, the Bolsheviks shut this down and basically began to suppress and repress and lock up all of their political enemies, basically, which helped sort of spark the Civil War, which united all of these disparate political groups and movements against the Bolsheviks. And then on top of it, you get foreign intervention. You get the British, you get the Japanese, and you get even some Americans landing troops on the edges of the former Russian Empire, trying to keep Russia in the war fighting against Germany and Austria. So it's a huge, complicated problem, huge mix. And then you get, the Civil War, in which the Reds, led by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, basically end up, after years of bloody struggle, defeating all their political opponents, but at great cost, both human cost in terms of millions of lives lost, but also basically the destruction of the whole infrastructure of the country. So then by 1921, Lenin and the new Bolshevik Soviet government are really barely hanging on to power. And there are riots against the Bolsheviks, there are protest movements against the Bolsheviks, even from their former most supportive groups in society, workers, sailors, even Red Army soldiers. And Lenin realizes by the spring of 21 that they need to retreat. They need to step back and try to solidify power as best they can and make reforms and concessions to groups that are not happy with them. And that's what they do, and they create this new period that becomes known as the New Economic Policy, that allows for greater freedoms, both economic and political, for various segments of society. But at the same time, when the second drought hits in the spring of 21, Lenin says, "Oh my God, there is no food left in this country. The grain is, withering on the stalks out in the fields. We won't survive without food." And he then, even though he distrusts the Americans profoundly as capitalists who are out to, overthrow the socialist revolution of the Bolsheviks, realizes that without allowing the Americans in, there's a real likelihood that the government itself will collapse. So it's a strategic concession to the West.
And maybe now is a good time that we could talk a little bit about the source base, something that all historians are always kind of interested in inquiring about. Is there some sort of oversight? Because it seems like the ARA would have been, had a sort of mandate to work in Western Europe, but this sort of Soviet Union, there's a lot of, the new economic policy, people in the West don't really know what it is, and then Westerners end up helping this regime, presumably. So this is kind of like a two-parted question. Like, how are you piecing this together as a historian, and then what are the sort of channels of oversight there in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, so I first heard about the American relief effort to Russia when I was researching an earlier book I wrote called Former People, which was the story of what happened to the Russian nobility after the revolution of 1917. And I was reading letters and accounts of former princesses and countesses and who were living in the early 20s, and they wrote about how the Americans had come and they were going to get jobs working for the Americans as interpreters and what have you. So I got intrigued because even though I'd been studying Russia for decades, I'd never really heard about the story. So, you start by checking what published materials there are. And I found that, in fact, there were already 3 books in English on this basic story. One written in the 20s as a sort of official account of what had happened. Then another came out, I believe it was in the 70s or early 80s, a shorter book that looked at the political aspect of the operation. And then around to early 2000s, there was a massive, like 800-page book by a Stanford professor on the relief operation. And so it's not like no one had studied it before. So I used those books as a way to figure out where the sources are. And the sources are primarily at the Hoover Institution Archive at Stanford University, which is where all the ARA official papers are, and a lot of the papers of the men who worked for the ARA. And then I tracked down other documents that had belonged to ARA operatives at the University of Virginia archives, Columbia University archives, the New York Public Library, and other places. So mostly stuff in the United States. I used a lot of Russian language materials that were already published, books and articles. And then I also found things in a few Russian archives as well. And what I wanted to do is, no one seemed to have ever heard of this story, thus the subtitle, The Forgotten Story. So what I wanted to do was something different. There are these academic books on the subject, but let's be honest, your average non-professional historian is not going to typically read scholarly books. Right. So again, I tried to write it in a way that's very much based on the lives of a few of these Americans who went over. I kept the book fairly short and tried to really recreate the human dimension of what this was like to experience, both as the poor people suffering from the famine, as well as from the Americans who went over to fight the famine.
Now, and that sounds like a fascinating source base. It really is interesting to hear the accounts of these people who went abroad and who, talk about a sort of ambitious project. I still have to convince undergrads to go study abroad, and I think everyone should. But these were people going in the 1920s when communication was much more difficult, but they certainly wrote a lot, which is great for our historians. Yeah, what are the sort of on the ground perspectives? It must be shocking to see a society that's having a great famine where people are desperate for food.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was really striking when I started to read the letters that these men were writing home, to read their diaries, to read their internal reports. I was struck by how devastated they were by just how bad things were, how shaken they were by the scale of human misery that they were encountering. And many of these men had fought in World War One. They had seen death, they had seen suffering, they had seen miserable things, but a lot of them were not able to cope with the sights that they encountered once they got into the famine areas in Russia. In fact, quite a few of them developed something that became known as famine shock. There was something known as shell shock in World War One. Men traumatized by fighting. We would call it PTSD today. And men started developing similar symptoms when they just witnessed the horror of so many dead and dying, starving bodies in Russia. So it was through their letters that I was able to, I hope, recreate the experiences of the American men when they got over there and started to really see the level of utter want and misery, and to create a picture that was true to the level of suffering without in any way sensationalizing it.
And we talk about sort of this memory. People have kind of forgotten that there's a big thing. We often talk about this death and suffering coming from World War One, and your book focuses on this period of potential ruin for the Soviet Union before the sort of famine that is perhaps better remembered. It's still fighting its own historical memory battles that happens 10 years later. Can you give us a sort of geographical scope of this famine in 1921?
So the 1921 famine is often referred to as the Volga River region famine, or the Povolzhia, Russian term for it, Povolzhia famine. The Volga River, that one of the great European rivers that flows throughout central Russia and then down into the Caspian Sea. And while those areas were sort of the epicenter of the famine, in fact, it was much bigger, much more broad spread. It actually covered 1 million square miles of territory. It extended all the way west into Ukraine, all the way east into the Ural Mountains, south into the Caucasus, and north up into areas around what was then known as Petrograd, St. Petersburg, Leningrad. So it was an enormous territory, much bigger than what people realize, and much bigger than the more famous famine of the 1930s under Stalin. And in fact, when I told people I was writing this book, they would always say, "Oh yes, I've heard of that famine. That was the famine under Stalin in the Ukraine." I say, actually, no, that's a different famine a decade later. And what's kind of paradoxical is the Soviet government did not try to hide from the outside world this famine of the 1920s. In fact, they broadcast it to the world because they wanted the world to come help them. Whereas under Stalin, the Soviet government did everything possible to hide the existence of famine in the country in the early 1930s. Yet that famine is better well known outside the Soviet Union. And that is chiefly, I think, due to the fact that it was largely centered in Ukraine, and a great number of Ukrainians later left the Soviet Union and made it their life's work to write and publish under Stalin in the 30s. So there's been a large, if you will, community of scholars and survivors of the famine in Ukraine who have made it their goal to make sure that the world knew about it and remembered it. This did not happen for the famine of the 20s.
It's kind of interesting because a lot of times that Americans go abroad and come back, that memory is sort of created. So this is one of the things I find fascinating about your book, is that Americans are going abroad, being in a part of the world that America doesn't quite know, and coming back, and yet because I don't know, do you know why they don't come back and broadcast more clearly experience in Russia? Did they try?
You say referring to the famine of the 20s?
Right. Yeah. Like I get the picture that Americans, dating back to wars and things like the Mexican-American War, a lot of Americans, there's this sort of return bravado from it.
Yes. Yes.
And did you find that among the ARA volunteers or people who went to the Soviet Union? Did they come back and want to talk about it?
They did want to talk about it, and it was very much a topic of the press and followed by the American public at the time. So if you read the major newspapers in 21 to 1923, there was often stories about the famine, about Hoover and the men of the ARA with photographs and all that kind of stuff. So it was something people knew about when it was happening, but then later it gets completely forgotten. And I think much of that has to do with the fact that Hoover's reputation was destroyed during his presidency when he failed to get the country out of the Depression. And he left, sort of a destroyed figure after his 4 years in office. That was one thing that sort of wipe out memory of this event. And also, I think the Cold War, especially, throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s, America did not necessarily want to dwell too much on moments when the US and Soviet Union cooperated on a large, operation of this sort. So I think that was those were elements that led to the story being forgotten. But the men who had worked for the ARA, they definitely talked about it when they got back. They gave interviews, they wrote about Russia. And for all of them that I encountered in the archives, those years they spent in Russia were probably the most powerful, impactful moments of their entire life. And many of them wanted to go back to Russia, or if they couldn't go back to Russia, they found themselves living in their memories of the experiences they'd had in Russia and never really got over them.
Wow, that's extraordinary. And it's also something that, when you talk to Russian experts and people who've been to Russia outside of famine, that seems to be a common thread. It's an incredible place. Now, one of the things you mentioned in your book is that Hoover sort of has to make a proclamation, or at least a promise, that the ARA wasn't going to be political. Can you talk a little bit about politics of this aid? What are the politics of dispersing the aid and working with the Soviet Union at this time of need?
Well, that's a great part of the story, and you're right to touch on that, because ideally what the Soviets wanted was America to bring food and other forms of relief over and then just give it to Soviet officials to disperse as they saw fit. But Hoover, in his wisdom, and he was right about this, insisted that they would control all aid until it was actually handed to the people who needed it. Because he knew that the Soviets would basically want to just give the aid to their constituents, to their supporters, and would in fact try to starve out anyone that they considered an enemy of the new regime. So what happened was the aid was to be given out by Americans and under American control to anyone who expressed interest or need in aid. So in that sense, Hoover was trying to cut through the politics internally to the Soviet Union. At the same time, though, he gave very strict orders to all the Americans who were going over to work in Russia that they were to avoid politics. They were not to try to drum up support for anti-Bolshevik elements. They were not supposed to engage in political propaganda or things like that, because he wanted the operation to be viewed as a purely humanitarian one that was not trying to lend support to any particular political group. And some would have, reviewed my book and said, well, isn't it kind of ironic, because maybe if they hadn't given aid to Lenin's Soviet Russia, the country would have collapsed, and then you never would have gotten Stalin and all those atrocities, which I think is kind of ridiculous. When people are, millions of people are suffering and on the brink of death, you need to do whatever you can to help them. And you can't then presume to understand how this will play out 10, 20 years after the fact. But Hoover was very much someone said, this is a humanitarian operation. We're going to help the poor, the suffering, the hungry, the needy, and we're not going to try to get involved in politics. Now, once they were in Russia, the Americans obviously started to talk politics. It was impossible not to. And what's interesting, and I try to bring out in my book, is how Americans there each kind of came up with their own political perspective on what was happening in the Soviet Union. Those who felt like the Soviet government was generally trying to do the right thing, that the revolution had been a move forward for Russia, and those who felt like, oh my God, this system is pure despotism and is something we need to wash our hands of and get out of here as soon as we can. Some insisted that we should be establishing official political diplomatic relations with the country, a fact that did not happen until the early 1930s under Roosevelt. That if we did that, we would somehow maybe be able to improve the situation there and modify their internal development, while others like Hoover said, until we know that, people and property will be fully respected by the force of law, there's no reason for us to get politically pulled into Russia, because basically it'll be an arbitrary system that we will, find incredibly frustrating and pointless to try to work with.
Yeah, and to imagine that the United States is working with essentially a nation that it doesn't recognize exists, maybe not unprecedented, but certainly create some interesting counterfactuals, like you said, of what might have happened. I can't help but to think that some of those different perspectives on Russia really show how diverse the nation is. Were there issues of religion and different sort of exposure to things like Orthodoxy and Islam that shocked the relief givers?
Well, one of the things that I tried to bring out in the book that I felt was timely for a Western audience, maybe not just American, but just, America and Europe, was that, the Americans, when they went over, were shocked to find the degree to which there was religious diversity in the lands of the former Russian Empire. Most of them didn't realize that when they were heading far to the east, up into the Urals, and those areas, that there were large Muslim populations, that these are the remnants of the old, Mongol hordes of the 13th century, and that as the Russian Empire grew, they had sort of taken over these large Muslim populations. And so it's interesting to read what the Americans thought when they encountered these people, Bashkirs and Tatars and others who were Muslims. And what's striking is that typically when you read the Americans' accounts, they're much more complimentary about the Muslim populations they encountered than they were the Russian Orthodox Christian populations. They found them to be more honest, more hardworking, more organized, obviously less prone to drunkenness and things like that. But that was another factor, and that was something I also tried to bring out in my book, is the diversity of the population that the Americans were dealing with, which is something that's typically forgotten. Most people think, well, Russia, that means Russian Orthodoxy, if anything, but it was a much more heterogeneous kind of population.
Very interesting. And you mentioned, so that we have these diversity of population, these sort of young American men going everywhere. When young American men tend to go to different nations, when young men of any nationality go to different nations, they tend to intermingle and mix and marry and have children. Did you find accounts like that?
Yes, quite a few. Again, my book focuses chiefly on the experience of 4 American men. And it's not, I need to keep repeating, it's not like I've ignored the women who are involved, but the ARA did not hire American women to go over. They feared that they would not be safe, so they hired only men. And this is the 1920s. This is, still height of American apartheid. Obviously, it was only white men who were being hired. They did not hire Jews to go over because they thought they would not be safe as well due to anti-Semitic pogroms and what have you. So we're really talking basically about white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men who were the only ones who were deemed qualified. Although one caveat is going through the photograph archive of the ARA at the Hoover Institution, I was sort of brought up when I saw two photographs of an African-American woman by the name of Emma. It's interesting, of course, the bias and prejudice of the day, they did not bother to record her last name.
Mm.
She was an American from Washington, D.C., apparently, who at some point, well, maybe even before the revolution, had ended up in Moscow, married a Russian man, and then was hired on by the ARA to work as a laundress. So as far as I know, she was the only person of color that ever was hired on by the ARA. But you're right about, the love affairs. The Americans who went over, they were young men, mostly in their 20s, most of them single. Very few, if any of them, knew any Russian. So they hired young Russian women as interpreters and translators, many of them from the former, upper classes of the old Tsar system. And there was a good deal of partying that went on. They brought their Victrolas with them. They brought phonograph records with them. So they would dance the foxtrot, which was all the craze in the 1920s. They did a good deal of drinking, carousing all night. And then obviously there were a good deal of love affairs. And in fact, quite a number of marriages. Incorporate all that side of the story into the book.
And now you're working with the famine. You said you put it down into 2 years. Was there a temptation to move on beyond 23? Was it even possible, or did the ARA just have to leave once things settled down?
Yeah, there was a good deal of debate within the leadership of the ARA about, okay, how long do we stay? Hoover had never been thrilled about going into Russia and knew working there would be a real challenge. So there was generally a sense that, okay, as soon as we can see the end of the famine, we are going to pack up and leave because it's very difficult to work there. And they were being pushed to leave by the Soviets. The Soviets, too, could see that the famine was tapering off. There was still hunger. There were still people in trouble, but they could sort of see their way clear of it. And they wanted the Americans out as soon as possible because from the very beginning, many in the Soviet government had viewed Hoover and the ARA as a Trojan horse, that they were going to allow in the ARA thinking they were just coming to help feed the country when in fact they would be surreptitiously organizing counter-revolutionary cells and organizations that would then try to overthrow the Soviet government. So as soon as the Soviets felt that they were pretty much free and clear of the worst of the famine, they were pushing the ARA to get out.
Interesting, and you've mentioned a little bit in the last few minutes of how you wanted to introduce to people how diverse the land is and things like that. Anyone who reads your book is certainly going to learn a lot, especially if they haven't had much exposure to Russia. But what were some things that you hope that this broader audience can take away from this tale that has been largely forgotten, at least in the American public sphere?
I mean, if there's one thing, I keep coming back to two words that Maxim Gorky, the famous Russian writer, used in a letter he wrote to Hoover, thanking him for all their help, and it's charity and compassion. Gorky writes how this is one of the great moments in world history, in all of humanity, when we have seen such an outpouring from one people to another of charity and compassion. And I feel personally that we're living through a moment in history where charity and compassion seem to be in short supply. And in fact, in some quarters, to even speak of charity and compassion is viewed as a weakness or some sort of, blindness, if you will. And I hope that the people who read this book will appreciate just how Russia has suffered, will appreciate how when we put our mind to helping people, we can tackle enormous problems. And this was an enormous problem that affected, tens of millions of people. on the far side of the globe, and America went over and saved probably over 10 million lives in a time when we had no computers, we had no internet, we had no, plane travel between continents and what have you. It was done with a very rudimentary, by our standards, technology. And Hoover did it in the face of a good deal of resistance in this country, this attitude of, well, why should we care about people starving on the other side of the globe? And he insisted over and over that it was a moral obligation that we had. And I think there's plenty of suffering abroad and plenty of suffering at home in our country, to be reminded of the need for charity and compassion. And this is a great study in a moment when the United States really did the right thing.
Yeah, it certainly is. And those are some great words to keep in mind. And you mentioned Gorky. You have material on him in the book, and people will see that in the role he played. Now you've mentioned you're sort of moving more towards the present in your march in Russian history, bringing Russian history to the masses here in the United States. What's up next for you?
Well, there's a couple things. I was involved in the discovery of an amazing photograph and 16 millimeter movie archive that had been created by an American military attaché in the last years of the Stalin regime. And I have put together a book of his photographs. They're all in color, which is remarkable, from the early 1950s. That'll be coming out with a publisher in Moscow in Russian. Unfortunately, I don't have a US publisher for that. So that's one project I'm working on. Another project I'm working on as we speak is a translation of one of the great Russian memoirs of the 20th century. Another fabulously talented Russian author by the name of Konstantin Paustovsky. Very little known in the West, but I'm doing a new translation of his memoir called The Story of a Life that'll be published by Vintage Classics. And it's the book that I fell in love with Russia with when I read it as a college student. And it's a beautiful evocation of life in the last years under the Tsars, and then World War I and the early years of the Soviet period. So I'm working on that, and we'll be turning that into the publisher in about a year or so.
Wow. And we sort of started with that, just to hear before we get to the suggestions, we sort of started with your background there in languages. I wonder, as you're working on a translation and you are, thinking in the language and thinking in two languages and how to bridge those gaps, you could speak about that and the sort of value that's had German and Russian and your history with languages. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I'm fighting a losing battle these days. I increasingly hear from folks who say, "Well, why do I need to study a foreign language when I've got Google Translate and things like that?" And I understand kind of where that attitude comes from. But as I keep saying to people, you don't study a foreign language just so you can, order in a restaurant or translate something you find online. Learning a foreign language is like entering a different world. It's a different mentality. It's a different way of seeing. It's a different way of understanding. I'm very much one who believes language is not a reflection of our reality, but it constructs our reality. And every language constructs reality in a somewhat different fashion. So for me, studying a foreign language is literally being able to enter completely a different culture, a different history, a different worldview. And so I keep beating the drum for the need to study foreign language without worrying about some very narrow utilitarian use for it. And I just love, I don't know, when I'm speaking Russian with Russian friends, I feel like somehow I've become a slightly different person. My name is different. I'm Douglas in English. In Russia, I'm Douglas. I mean, I become a different person. So I can't stress it enough. We stress it, my wife and I, with our own children and their education, and I think it's something that we as Americans, really could do a better job at.
Yeah, and I think that's all great, and I love of hearing from people who've had those experiences, and especially translation is such an interesting and underappreciated task.
Well, it is, and it's also you realize too when you try to do it that it's an impossible task, and that's part of the fun of trying to do it is, there's no straight one-to-one connection between one word in one language and another in another, because they fit in a different world and they relate to the words in their own language in a different way than they do in a different foreign language. So I enjoy this translation project's epically large. It's almost 700 pages.
Oh.
And, I'm not making great speed with it, but because I find myself rewriting the same sentence 4 or 5 times, and each one I realize isn't quite there, but it's all about just getting as close as possible. But you never quite hit that target.
And I imagine it adds a different dimension that you mentioned. You fell in love with it at a different time. It brings back memories too, I'm sure.
Yeah, and to have seen, how Russia has changed since I first started studying the language in like 1980, 81. Just as the country has totally changed, the language has totally changed. The influx of English language words into Russian in the last 20 years has been utterly remarkable as well. So the country changes, then the language changes, the whole thing is sort of mutating.
That's fantastic. We'll have to keep an eye out for that. Unfortunately, we're drawing close to the end here, but fortunately, we get to make our suggestions to the Hour of History podcast listeners. So, Douglas, what would you suggest that these people all over the world, people in the United Kingdom listening, in Australia, in India, in the United States, what would you suggest to them?
Well, there's a few books that I would love to point out to people. One of the historians writing that got me excited about history was Robert Darnton, who taught a long time at Princeton, still does, mostly at French Revolution. But pick up a book like, The Great Cat Massacre or Mesmerism. Those are great books. If you're more inclined to English history, I had the great pleasure and privilege to study at UCLA under John Brewer, great historian of England. He has a book called The Pleasures of the Imagination, sort of a cultural history of England that's really spectacular. And then if you're leaning towards Russia, I would suggest 2 books. One book that really hooked me on Russian history was by the former Librarian of Congress, a Russian scholar by the name of James Billington. But he wrote, I think, as a Westerner, the best overall interpretive history of Russian culture. It's called The Icon and the Axe. Still warrants reading, and it's just incredible erudition and insight and beautiful writing. And then if you want maybe just to fall into a remarkable story, biography, I would suggest Robert Massey's Nicholas and Alexandra, the classic story of the end of the Romanov dynasty that he wrote in the 1960s. Sadly, Robert Massey just died within the last week or so. I got to know him over the years, and he was a marvelous man, a wonderful writer, took his craft very seriously. Not a trained professional historian, but someone who really wrote, in my opinion, really fine books about Russian history.
Those are all excellent suggestions, and I think aspiring historians will do well to read all of those. And like you said, there is a quality to the writing as well as the quality to the history that's just sort of unmistakable in some of those works. I'm going to suggest just one, sort of similar vein, and also I guess it will be in the same UCLA area. One of my favorite books as an undergrad was about French history, was Peasants into Frenchmen, by Eugene Weber. And that's another one, it's a massive book, and it's even though we've gone decades from when it was first published, it's just, even though it's in ant print, tiny print, you just want to read every word. These are well-written, intriguing histories, and thank you so much for those suggestions. It reawakens that love for well-written history.
Yeah, well, Eugen Weber was there when I was at UCLA, and a brilliant scholar, again, who realized that history is a literary art. His lectures on Western civilization, which were taped and a TV show on PBS, really warrant. If you don't get around to reading that great book you mentioned, search for Eugen Weber's lectures on Western civilization, and they're brilliant and incredibly entertaining.
That's great. Well, I hope everyone will head over to hourofhistory.com to get links to Douglas Smith's work as well. The new book is The Russian Job, The Forgotten Story of How America Saved the Soviet Union from Ruin. Thank you so much for joining us on the Hour of History.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, on Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, anyplace.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.